The certified envelope arrived during the third week of unpacking. I was standing at my kitchen counter in Briar Glen, surrounded by half-open moving boxes, flattened cardboard, and a stack of mail I hadn't bothered to sort, when the postal carrier handed it through the open door. The return address belonged to a law firm. I signed for the delivery, set it on the counter, and opened it. The first page was a letter from an attorney I'd never met. It stated that Janice and Mark Caldwell claimed I owed them $68,500 in past family advances. The letter demanded payment. It said nothing about owning any part of my house. I read that sentence twice. $68,500. I had just put $64,000 down on this bungalow from my savings. The similarity felt like a mirror held at the wrong angle. I had spent years building that reserve, watching it grow slowly. Every extra shift, every delayed repair on my car, had gone into that account to buy a house my parents had never set foot in before their visit. Behind the letter sat a dated schedule. Janice had organized old family transfers under short labels and treated each one as a repayable advance. The descriptions were in her handwriting, familiar from decades of birthday cards and grocery lists. One entry stopped me harder than the total. The original $11,400 loan Mark gave me about 4 years earlier. I remembered paying that back in full. I remembered making the transfers over the following year, watching my checking account balance drop, and feeling the relief of having it done. The schedule showed it as still owing. The line had no payment date next to it. I set the packet down and looked at the closing folder beside it. The folder took me back to their visit 2 weeks earlier. Janice walked through the bungalow and praised every room, touching the kitchen counter to say the granite was a nice choice. Mark asked practical questions about the detached garage, checking whether it had good insulation and whether a car could fit comfortably. Tessa walked into the spare bedroom and stood in the center of it, turning slowly, measuring it with her eyes. She explained that her boutique fitness studio lease was ending badly. The business had drained her savings, and she said she could no longer afford her apartment either. She floated the spare room and garage as a temporary base to rebuild her client list. She said she would pay utilities and keep the space tidy. I told her I needed time to think about what she was asking. The following week, Janice followed up and treated the idea as nearly settled. She called to ask what day Tessa could bring her things. That was when I gave a clear answer. Tessa was not moving in, and the garage was unavailable. Janice called the refusal selfish, arguing that family helped family and I had the space. Mark added that I always handled more than anyone else. He didn't phrase it as an accusation, but it landed like one anyway. Back in the present, my laptop screen still showed the spreadsheet Tessa had emailed before the dispute. She had asked me to sort her studio expenses and cancellation fees. I opened the file because I had promised I would, and because that was the role I always played. I got through only a few rows before realizing what I was doing. Even after receiving a $68,500 demand, I was still performing unpaid cleanup for the sister whose crisis was pressing against my new house. The spreadsheet listed vendor payments, equipment penalties, and late fees, numbers I had no stake in. I closed Tessa's spreadsheet unfinished. I almost never did that with the family task. I called Janice once and asked what the $68,500 was supposed to represent, keeping my voice even. Then I pointed out that the schedule counted the old $11,400 loan as unpaid. Janice refused to debate individual entries by phone. She said the attorney had the records now and I should direct my questions there. Mark joined the call and went quiet when I named the old loan. The silence stretched on the line. It sounded as if he had not known Janice's current schedule, still counted it as owing. Mark asked me not to turn a family disagreement into a war. He used the same tone he relied on when I was a teenager, and he wanted me to stop pushing. Tessa later texted that I shouldn't make things worse than they had to be. She didn't specify what things she meant. I answered neither message. I scanned the certified packet and put it beside my house keys. Then I opened the annual folder where I save old bank statements. I decided to check the record before I called anyone again. The next morning, before work, I opened the archived bank PDFs on my laptop. The yearly folders held each monthly statement in order. I pulled the records from the period when I repaid Mark. The transfers were easy to find. I had sent the money from my checking account over the following year, tracking the withdrawals until the total reached the full $11,400. Watching the dates and amounts line up on the screen brought back the relief of a debt finally closed. I didn't find Mark's written acknowledgement in those specific files, but the payment trail was complete. The money left my account and landed in his. My memory was not the problem. I also pulled the closing statement and account history from the house purchase. The $64,000 down payment for the $352,000 house came from my savings account at the same bank. The statement showed the withdrawal date and the amount. The money belonged to me long before it went anywhere near the property. There was no loan document, promissory note, or repayment schedule. While the documents didn't answer every item Janice called in advance, they immediately contradicted one major line in the demand. The $11,400 was not still owing. The closing records also established that the entire $64,000 down payment had come from my own savings. I printed the relevant pages and slipped them into a folder with the certified packet. The stack was thin, just a few statements, one closing document, and the demand letter. It didn't look like much, but it was enough to show that the numbers in the schedule failed to match my records. After my shift as a medical billing supervisor, I met with local civil attorney Dana Pike for an initial consultation. Her office sat in the strip mall between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop. I brought the certified packet, the repayment records, and the closing documents. Dana sat behind a desk holding a single monitor and a neat stack of manila folders. She read the demand letter without reacting, then reviewed the schedule alongside my printed records. "This is a disputed claim," she said. "It's not proof that anyone can take your house." She recommended preserving every record I could find, stopping the factual arguments over the phone and keeping any response narrow and written. I told her I needed a communication buffer to handle the back and forth so I could focus on working and sleeping. I hired Dana to review the records, communicate with my parents' attorney, and attend any settlement meeting that followed. The first fee came from my emergency reserve. I had set that money aside for repairs and furniture, anticipating the kind of expenses that come with a house. Now it was going to someone who would read letters I could have written myself, if anyone in my family had been willing to read them fairly. I paid with my debit card and watched the balance drop. After hiring Dana, I sent Janice and Mark one short email the next morning. I stated that I disputed the amount and requested all communications go through my attorney. I didn't attach a family history or defend my character. I hit send and closed the window. Janice answered in the family group text within an hour, declaring she couldn't believe I involved an attorney in a private family matter. Several relatives began asking what happened, including cousins I hadn't spoken to in months, and an aunt who usually only texted on birthdays. None of them had seen the demand packet, and none of them knew what the $68,500 was supposed to cover. I replied only that the dispute was between me and my parents. As the hours passed and no one jumped in to change the subject, the distance in the thread widened. But my silence kept Janice from turning every answer into another argument. At work the following day, Monica Reed noticed I skipped lunch to organize records. The office was quiet, most of the billing staff at their desks with headphones on. She left half her takeout on my desk, still warm in the container, and stood there long enough that I looked up. "You want company after work?" she asked. I considered the spreadsheet Tessa sent, filled with studio expenses and cancellation fees I promised to sort. The numbers blurred on the screen. "I could use dinner," I said. I closed Tessa's spreadsheet and went to dinner with Monica instead. That night, I placed the certified packet, the printed repayment records, and the closing statement into a plain file box. Taking a permanent marker, I labeled the folder with the date the letter arrived instead of my family's name or the dollar amount. I closed the lid and set the box on the shelf beside my house keys. During the weeks that followed, I worked through my archived statements and emails in short sessions after work, keeping the process narrow enough that the dispute didn't consume every evening. Some nights I spent 30 minutes at the dining table, sorting printed records by date and amount. Other nights I cross-referenced old transfers against the demand letter until my eyes blurred, then closed the folder and went to bed. Several items Janice labeled as advances in the demand letter were described differently when they happened. One was a birthday laptop from 3 years ago. I found the email thread where Janice offered to buy it, and I offered to pay half. Janice refused. "It's your birthday," she wrote. "Let us handle it." Now that laptop appeared on the parent schedule as an advance. Another was a reimbursement for a family trip. I found the group text where we split a cabin rental 3 ways. Janice sent her share of the cost after I booked it, but now that transfer appeared as a loan. A third was a car repair Mark told me I didn't need to repay. I found his text message. "Don't worry about it. We've got it covered." Now that transfer appeared as an outstanding balance. Taken one by one, the messages could be argued over. Together, they showed how broadly Janice was rewriting the past. The $11,400 repayment transfers remained the clearest financial thread, and I could trace each one back to the original loan and forward to the final payment. The $64,000 down payment trail remained separate proof that the new house was purchased with my money. I kept those two trails in their own folder, separate from the rest of the archive. Through Dana, the parents' attorney provided a spreadsheet containing dates, transfer amounts, short labels, and a handful of old notes Janice claimed showed repayment was expected. It placed birthday gifts, reimbursements, and the original $11,400 loan in one category, then ignored the repayments I had made to Mark. Dana asked the other side to identify which remaining entries they actually contended were loans or repayable advances. I authorized her to share only the repayment trail and the source of my down payment at that stage. I didn't send the full archive, nor did I send the emails where Mark told me the car repair was covered. One Saturday, Aunt Celia visited and found my dining table covered with labeled folders instead of moving boxes. I had meant to clear it before she arrived, but the sorting took longer than expected. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the spread. Celia, Janice's younger sister, picked up a folder, read the label, and set it down without asking what each one contained. "Janice has called you the strong one since you were teenagers," she said, "especially whenever Tessa needed money, or rides, or forms completed, or a problem cleaned up." I had heard the phrase before, but I had never stopped to count how often it arrived alongside a request. Strong meant capable. Capable meant available. Available meant responsible. What she said did not surprise me. It did make the pattern impossible to ignore. The problem wasn't in the numbers, it was in who always got asked. Janice called selected relatives before I could, describing the dispute as me refusing to acknowledge years of parental help. The relatives' messages stayed coded. They told me to be grateful, to stop wasting money on lawyers, and to remember that Tessa was going through a hard time. I replied once that the dispute was between me and my parents, then left it there. The distance in the family thread grew wider, but I had already stopped expecting the thread to solve anything. Mark separately emailed me a household insurance renewal. He asked me to compare options for him, as if the legal demand and the old family workflow could continue at the same time. The email was brief and practical. It assumed I would handle the task the way I always did. I replied that I would not manage the renewal, providing only the customer service number from the document. I had never handed a family task back so cleanly. I closed the email window and didn't reopen it. I began to understand why Janice kept pressing. She had expected the attorney letter to produce a quick compromise. Instead, hiring Dana had turned one pressure tactic into an expense she now had to justify to herself and the family. Every week that passed without a settlement made the demand harder to defend. Tessa still needed a place to land, and Janice still didn't want that problem back in her own house. So she kept pressing, even as the paper trail became harder to defend. Late that month, Janice asked for one in-person family meeting before the lawyers make it impossible to come back from this. I agreed because a part of me still wanted to believe a clear record could restore a normal conversation. I drove the familiar 20 minutes to my parents' split level on a Sunday afternoon, roughly 5 weeks after the demand arrived. The glass dining table took up most of the breakfast nook. I had sat at it for hundreds of meals, tax returns, insurance renewals, and family discussions where the outcome was already decided before I spoke. Janice sat across from me, while Mark took the end, and Tessa sat beside her mother, with her phone face down on the glass. I placed one summary page on the table containing just 2 lines, the $11,400 repayment trail, and the source of my $64,000 down payment. I included no birthday gifts, car repairs, or reimbursements. I wanted to focus on the repaid loan and the money I had put into the house myself. "I want one thing," I said. "Withdraw the $68,500 demand. Leave my house out of Tessa's problems." Janice looked at the page without touching it, the way a person views something they intend to ignore. "Erin, you're reducing a lifetime of care to accounting," she said. "The family supported you in ways no spreadsheet can measure." I waited for her to point to a specific line on my page and tell me it was wrong, but she didn't. Mark shifted in his chair. "The old loan is only one part of the larger dispute. You keep treating every family contribution as if it needs a label." "Mark," I said, "was the $11,400 loan repaid?" He knew, and I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes. The schedule counted a loan he had already closed out, yet he sat at this table refusing to say yes. "The old loan is not the point anymore," he said. Tessa picked up her phone and set it down. "I never wanted lawyers involved. This entire problem could become simpler if you'd let me stay in the spare room while I get back on my feet." I looked at her. "What does you living in my house have to do with an alleged debt?" Janice answered before Tessa could. "We're trying to solve two problems before both become expensive. You have space. Tessa needs space. It's reasonable. You're asking me to let her live in a house you're also claiming I owe you money for." "We're not claiming," Janice said. "We're asking you to recognize what the family has given you." Then Janice reached for the role she had spent years assigning me. She leaned forward, her voice softening. "Erin, you have always been the capable daughter. Why are you suddenly acting as if helping would ruin your life?" Mark nodded. "Tessa cannot carry what you can carry." The argument worked because I'd always been proud of being the capable daughter. I had built my identity around it. I started explaining how much the house cost, how thin my reserve was, and how the legal fees were draining it. I stopped mid-sentence when I heard myself proving that I deserved to keep what I bought. I folded my page and stood up. When nobody asked me to stay, I took the summary with me rather than leaving it on the table for them to reinterpret. The following week, Dana's invoice landed in my email during month-end billing. I opened it at my desk and saw how much of my emergency reserve had already gone toward the dispute. Every dollar I spent on the argument was a dollar I couldn't put into the house. At work, I caught a routine coding error in a report just before submission. I checked that line twice and still missed it the first time. I fixed the mistake, but it was an oversight I normally would never make. Rather than staying late and hiding my distraction, I walked to my manager's office, explained I needed a personal afternoon for a legal meeting, and asked to reorganize my workload around it. Monica overheard from the next desk and offered to cover a routine check while I was out. I thanked her, but told her I would still be responsible for my own deadlines. That night, Mark called, asking to talk without Janice. We met in the office parking lot after work, standing between our cars in the dark. He didn't apologize for letting the demand continue after learning the old loan was repaid. Standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, he simply asked me to let Tessa stay for a while so everyone could stop paying lawyers and have some peace. The offer sounded like the quickest way to restore quiet, and I could feel the word yes forming in my throat. "Mark," I said, "was the $11,400 loan repaid?" He looked at the ground. "The old loan is not the point anymore." His refusal to say yes told me everything. Admitting the loan was closed would tear a hole in Janice's schedule, and he would rather protect her version than tell me the truth. I told him I would think about Tessa staying, then got in my car and drove home. That evening, I opened the family budgeting files I had maintained for years, a collection of spreadsheets, account logins, renewal dates, and tax documents. I had kept them organized because nobody else would, accepting that being the capable daughter meant keeping the family running. I sent Mark a message with the location of every file, stating that I would no longer update them, renew accounts, or manage deadlines. I hit send before I could reconsider, then opened the draft text where I almost offered Tessa the spare room and deleted it. I walked to the dining room and turned on the light. The family file box sat untouched on the table exactly where I had left it. I stood there for a moment before turning the light off. Nothing was solved and the money demand remained active, but one source of free labor was finally gone. The file box stayed in the dining room. I passed it every morning on my way to the kitchen and every evening when I came home, leaving the lid shut. Over the following several weeks, the dispute entered its third month. Through their attorneys, both sides exchanged the records they were willing to share. The folder Dana forwarded from the other side contained dated transfer receipts and notes from Janice. Some entries were labeled as gifts while others had no label at all. One was marked as help with closing costs, and another as a holiday advance. The original $11,400 loan appeared on an old tracking sheet, but the final repayments were missing. The balance had simply been left open. My own records separated the actual $11,400 loan from the gifts, reimbursements, and other disputed support. I kept the receipts and bank statements showing my down payment deposit alongside the transfer confirmations for the old loan repayments. Nothing in my folder contradicted what I had told Dana from the beginning. I kept going to work and rebuilt my routines with Monica, who stopped asking how the dispute was going after I told her there was nothing new to report. I restricted my record review to scheduled evenings twice a week so the conflict no longer owned every hour. On the other nights, I cooked dinner, watched television, or sat on the porch until the streetlights came on. Using the dates of my final repayment transfers from about 4 years earlier, I narrowed the search parameters in my archived email. I had thousands of messages stored in that account, forcing me to spend 3 evenings scrolling through old messages, family check-ins, and spam before finding what I needed. I finally located the message Mark sent right after my last payment cleared. It was brief and carried no subject line. Last payment came through. That loan is done. I read the words 3 times, printed a copy for my physical folder, and forwarded the digital thread to Dana. The email did not settle every disputed transfer, but it proved that Mark had known the $11,400 loan was closed, and had allowed the $68,500 demand to continue anyway. Soon afterward, Dana forwarded a written proposal from the parent's attorney. I opened the PDF at my kitchen counter and read through the formal phrasing. The document stated that Janice and Mark would withdraw the $68,500 demand and each side would bear its own expenses. In exchange, I would agree to let Tessa live in the spare bedroom for 6 months and use the detached garage for equipment, storage, and remote sessions, while she rebuilt her income. The only fact that mattered to me was that access to my home had finally been written into the bargain. For the first time since the certified letter arrived, the money pressure and Tessa's housing problem appeared together in a formal communication. I no longer had to guess why the legal demand followed so closely after my refusal. I printed the proposal and set it on the counter. The terms were clear. Withdraw the demand, pay your own lawyer, give Tessa a room, and have peace. Janice sent me one personal text that evening, calling the proposal the cleanest solution for everybody. I read it and locked my phone, leaving the message unanswered. Celia came over after dinner and sat at the kitchen counter while I reread the printed proposal. She looked at the pages and asked one question. Could you still live in this house the way you intended if you agreed? I thought about it. The spare room would become Tessa's territory. The garage would become storage space for fitness equipment I didn't own. I would have to manage my own household schedule around someone else's remote working sessions. I would become the capable daughter again, running the family's logistics from my own home. No, I said. Ending the money pressure by restoring the old family role would still mean paying with my home and my labor. The next morning, I drove to Dana's office to prepare for the private settlement meeting. I told her I would discuss only an end to the money demand. Tessa's occupancy, garage access, and any future administrative help were off the table. Dana asked if I understood what refusing those terms might mean. I said yes, refusing might mean more legal expense, continued pressure, and a deeper family rupture. She didn't argue or push me to compromise. Instead, she took out a yellow legal pad and wrote down exactly what terms I would accept. I watched her draw a thick line beneath the house access demands and turn the page over, physically closing off that part of the negotiation. I left her office with my printed records tucked under my arm, knowing exactly what I wouldn't trade. The conference room was small for 6 people. A rectangular table took most of the space. Dana and I sat facing the door with Janice, Mark, Tessa, and the parents' attorney across from us. A pitcher of water stood untouched in the center. Mark had brought no papers. Tessa kept her hands in her lap. Janice's purse sat zipped shut beside her chair. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. Celia stayed in the lobby. She drove us both to the office so I wouldn't have to navigate traffic afterward. She told me she would be there when I came out, and I believed her. She didn't need to be inside the room to be present. The parent's attorney opened the folder and laid out the known documents in a neat row across the table. He acknowledged the $11,400 repayment records and Mark's email confirming the loan was closed, noting those entries were no longer in dispute. Setting his hand on a separate stack, he maintained that the other dated transfers remained open because Janice understood them as advances expected to be repaid. He didn't call them loans, he used the word advances, speaking as if the distinction made the claim more reasonable. Dana answered without hesitation. She stated that the remaining entries were not documented consistently as loans, pointing out that some were labeled as gifts in Janice's own handwriting, while others lacked any label at all. She confirmed I was prepared to keep disputing every one of them. Dana spoke evenly, maintaining the same measured tone she used in every conversation we had, never raising her voice for emphasis. Once the records were laid out, the practical question was simple. Would Janice and Mark keep paying to press a contested demand, or end it? The attorney waited. Mark shifted in his chair. No one spoke to fill the empty space. Janice set her hands flat on the table and turned her attention to Tessa, describing the proposed arrangement as simple. 6 months in my spare room would give Tessa stability and make the entire dispute unnecessary. The money demand would disappear, the legal cost would stop, and everyone could go back to daily life. She outlined the trade calmly, confident I would accept the logic. Tessa spoke next. She promised she would stay out of my way, keep any in-person work elsewhere, and bring no clients to the house. Her voice was careful, and she looked at me rather than Janice when she spoke, asking for nothing more than what the proposal already stated. Mark added that the arrangement would let everyone leave the room and stop paying attorneys. He presented it as the most practical answer, looking directly at me to gauge my reaction. Janice caught my eye next, telling the room that the family always depended on me because I was the one who could handle difficult things. She offered it as a compliment, treating my compliance as the natural conclusion. I knew that sentence. It had put me in charge of medical paperwork and made me the default administrator for every family task no one else wanted. It had worked for years because I mistook being needed for being valued. Hearing it now, I finally saw it clearly. I said, "No one is moving into my house, and my house is not part of this agreement." The room went quiet. The attorney stopped arranging his papers. Janice's expression didn't change as she reframed my refusal to help Tessa as abandonment. She used the word like a settled fact, delivering it as if the label itself should make me reconsider. I added one line. "I'm done being the solution to problems I didn't create." I turned to Dana and instructed her to reject every house access term. I told her to make no offer involving my property or unpaid family work, then stated I was ending direct bargaining with Janice, Mark, and Tessa. I didn't read out a list of grievances or ask the room to agree with me. I stood and left the conference room before Janice could restart the family argument in the hallway. I didn't look back or wait for Dana to follow. I walked down the short hallway to the lobby. The carpet was gray. The walls were beige. The building was completely ordinary. Celia was already standing when I reached her. She didn't ask whether we won. I said no. She nodded and walked with me to the parking lot. We didn't talk in the car. She drove me home, told me she would call later, and waited until I went inside. I let myself in and locked the door behind me. The house was quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long time before moving. Within the next several days, Dana forwarded written notice from the parents' attorney. The letter stated that Janice and Mark were withdrawing the $68,500 demand and didn't intend to pursue the listed claim further. I read it twice. They had backed down. The letter couldn't return the money I had spent or repair the family. It only meant they had stopped coming after me. I kept a copy in the file box, but I didn't frame it or show it to anyone. I paid Dana's remaining bill. Looking at my bank balance afterward, I saw the permanent hole the dispute left in my emergency reserve. The number was precise, and I knew exactly what that money would have covered. I closed the banking app and set the phone face down on the counter. I blocked direct calls and texts from Janice, Mark, and Tessa. I didn't resume routine contact. I didn't announce the boundary. I stopped answering, and the phone stopped lighting up with their names within a week. Back at home, I took the spare key from the kitchen drawer. The small two-hook rail by the back door had been empty since I moved in. I had bought it at a hardware store and installed it myself, but I had never used it. The key had stayed in the drawer because I hadn't decided who else should have one. I hung the key on the first hook. The metal clicked against the rail. The second hook stayed bare. For the first time since closing, nobody else had a plan for that key. 10 months after the settlement meeting, nearly 14 months after I bought the house, the bungalow finally looked lived in rather than defended. The kitchen counters held mail, a cookbook, and a jar of utensils I used daily. The living room had shoes by the couch and a blanket that stayed on the armchair because I actually used it. No renewed $68,500 demand had arrived. I had rebuilt only part of the emergency reserve I spent on the dispute. The number was still lower than I wanted. The planned kitchen upgrade was still postponed, a practical reminder that keeping the house and the boundary was not free. I looked at the old cabinets and accepted the delay. It was a cost I chose. During the 10-month gap, I had a second spare key cut for emergency use. The original spare from the meeting and the new copy now hung side by side on the two-hook rail at the back door. I had installed that rail the week I moved in, but for months it held nothing. Now it held two keys. The metal hooks were visible behind them, small and silver. Certain things didn't come back. I missed family holidays and didn't resume routine direct contact with Janice, Mark, or Tessa. Some relatives stopped contacting me after Janice's version of events hardened. I didn't know the shape of the story she told, and I didn't need to. The silence from certain cousins and aunts was consistent enough to read. I didn't call them, and they didn't call me. The phone stayed quiet on holidays. Some holidays still hurt. But the quiet no longer felt like punishment. Celia mentioned once that Tessa was renting a room elsewhere and teaching classes through a gym rather than using my property. Janice and Mark had adjusted their routines without me maintaining their paperwork. I didn't ask for more detail. I didn't want to know whether the $68,500 figure still circulated, or whether Tessa blamed me for the move. Celia offered what she had and let the subject close. Before Sunday dinner with Monica and Celia just inside the back entry, I took both spare keys from the rail. The metal was cool against my fingers. I gave one to Celia and one to Monica for emergencies, and the practical reasons trusted people have keys. Neither woman treated the gesture as a ceremony. Monica slipped hers onto her keyring without looking down. Celia closed her hand around hers and asked where I kept the extra paper towels. I pointed to the pantry. Celia opened the door, pulled out a roll, and set it on the counter. I had just handed over the 2 spare keys to my house, and no one had made it into an event. After dinner, Monica carried a casserole dish to the sink and started washing while Celia dried. I automatically reached for the towel and said I could handle it. Monica told me to sit down because I cooked. I started to object, then returned to my chair and let somebody else finish a task in my house. The exchange was small enough that no one commented on it. Monica turned back to the sink and Celia set a dried plate in the rack. The water ran and the conversation moved on. I sat at the table and listened to them talk. I didn't have to do anything. I just sat there. The kitchen was warm, and the sound of dishes and voices filled the space in a way that felt natural. Later, I stepped out the back door for a moment. The air was cool and the yard was dark. I stood on the porch for maybe a minute. When I came back inside, I could hear Monica and Celia talking in the kitchen. The water was still running. I looked at the 2 empty hooks on the key rail. The keys were gone because I handed them over myself.